Good morning. Good morning. And to those on Zoom, anti-Semitism is on the rise. All you got to do is watch the news and see that. So what is this really all about? Anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in the psyche of Western civilization. And to get rid of it will take removal of something equally deeply embedded. That something is the myth of original sin, which is the dogma of all dogmas. Imagine that you are teaching a Sunday school class. 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, children, the Jewish tribe claimed that they had been chosen by God to be his people, the quote, treasured possession. In the Bible, in Deuteronomy, it says that they were chosen to be a light unto the world. Then, 2,000 years ago, a young, rogue, dark-skinned, Semitic, Jewish carpenter, preacher, and religious zealot was going around stirring up the people and preaching weird stuff. He told them to leave their wives, leave their children, leave their jobs, leave their homes, and to follow him, because the world was going to end very soon, and they had to get right with God or else. The Jewish establishment and the Roman rulers did not like this guy. So the Romans nailed him to a cross along with two other guys they wanted to punish. And Yeshua, the carpenter, died on that cross. That much is fact. The rest is myth. Maybe the Romans got upset about the claim the Jewish people made that they were chosen by their God. Maybe they just didn't like the Jewish carpenter guy stirring up crowds of people. Maybe the Jewish tribe saw him as a troublemaker. Whatever. Later on, children, the carpenter was believed to be God. That was myth, not fact. It is hard for those who believe in a myth to see it as a myth, especially if it becomes dogma. And even though the carpenter was Jewish, his followers claim they blamed the Jews for killing the carpenter, who they said was the Christ. But Jesus, whose name in Hebrew was Yeshua, was not thought to be the Christ at the moment he was crucified. In fact, Jesus was not a Christian, which term came later from his being called the Christ from the Greek word Christos, which in Hebrew means Messiah. It is a myth that has survived for 2,000 years. End of Sunday school class. Okay, come forward to 1950. As a student at UCLA in a fraternity, a Jewish fraternity, I played in an interfraternity flag football game. Against all odds, one day our team beat the Gentile fraternity team in a game. They, the Gentile fraternity guys, were so mortified and upset about losing to the Jews that they came out onto the front lawn of the frat house and began yelling at us, who had gathered outside our frat house across the street from theirs. They shouted at us, Christ killers, kikes, and other anti-Semitic names. They had been taught that the Jews killed Jesus, when in historical fact, it was the Romans who killed him after the Jews asked them if they would do it. The Romans had a choice, kill him or not kill him. They decided to kill Yeshua. But the Christians later said that the Jews did it. That was the first big lie. That lie is still believed today, 2,000 years later. They seemingly had no interest in correcting the mistake. There was and still is a ton of cultural gravity perpetuating that lie. Some very famous people like Henry Ford and Woodrow Wilson were virulent anti-Semites, setting a modern cultural example of continuing to perpetuate the lie. As we all know, down through history, the Jewish people have been hated, forced into ghettos, and eventually subjected to genocide in the Holocaust. The question is, why? Why has this happened? Why have the Jews always been either scapegoated, kicked out, or locked in ghettos? Is it enough to explain it that the ancient Hebrews claimed to be chosen people? Is it enough to explain it with the big lie about who killed the so-called Christ? I don't think so. Is it enough that the Jews did not accept Jesus as the Messiah, as their Savior? I don't think those reasons are enough to explain it. I think there are two other major reasons why anti-Semitism has happened. The first reason is most people seem to need someone to blame and hate. The need to have a scapegoat, as it were, so they don't have to assign any blame to themselves. It's not a physical need. It's an emotional need, but it can be just as strong as a physically addictive need. It begins in childhood when they do something and then blame it on their imaginary friend. This later on morphs into blaming it on the devil or some outgroup or some group that they can feel superior to. The anti-Semites need to have some group they can feel better than. As President Lyndon Johnson said, and I paraphrase, if you can keep the whites feeling they are better than the blacks, you can pick the whites' pockets forever. Even today, the crazies in the MAGA tribe have in their heads that our problems are due to an imaginary Jewish conspiracy. So why the Jews? Well, they have had no armies with which to defend themselves until 1947. They have been in the minority in every country. They don't proselytize. They've been easy to pick on. I think until recently, the Jews have always internalized, probably unconsciously, the idea that, well, that's just the way it is. Don't make waves. This has had great survival value for the Jews, given that they had no army and were vastly outnumbered. The Jews in Hitler Germany, with not many exceptions, in spite of 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, thought of themselves as good Germans, no problem. Yet, if you think about it, in the last 400 years, the four men who have had a tremendous impact on Western civilization have been Jews: Baruch Spinoza, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein. Each of them has made a difference that has changed the world. This brings me to the second major reason for anti-Semitism besides scapegoating. It has to do with psychological projection. And one of the definitions for that is this, quote, psychological projection is a defense mechanism people subconsciously employ in order to cope with difficult feelings or emotions. Psychological projection involves projecting undesirable feelings or emotions about oneself onto someone else or some group, rather than admitting to or dealing with the unwanted feelings about oneself. Okay, so why does the Christian West hate the Jews, the anti-Semites? Why We can argue about just how continuous that hate has been, or argue about how violent or less violent, or how virulent or less virulent it has been at different times. But that hatred has to be explained. Scapegoating alone cannot explain it. It is my theory that the hatred of the Jews, historically and currently, is a function of projection of unconscious self-hatred, a function of projection of unconscious self-hatred. It's a second causative factor for anti-Semitism in addition to scapegoating. I mean, think about it. A baby is born in a Christian culture. At the moment of birth, he or she is thought by Christians to be morally corrupt, a sinner due to original sin. When that outrageous child abusive theological concept is believed, then that baby needs salvation in order to avoid eternal punishment from the Christian God. Not too long after birth, the infant is introduced to a series of rituals and ceremonies to deal with this sinfulness. All of these rituals and ceremonies have but one goal: to keep the child bought into the need for salvation. From what? From sin. How can an impressionable child escape from internalizing the self-concept that he or she is rotten, no good, and feeling a ton of guilt? Every adult authority in the child's world says that that's true. You're a sinner, a wretch. This is not a feeling about oneself that fosters mental health. It poses to the person a challenge to develop some self-esteem to overcome the negative self-image. Most people do not do well with that challenge. It can be disguised by accumulating lots of money, or getting famous, or by winning contests of all kinds, or by burying it under physical beauty, or being a bully, or gaining political power, or many other ways. But the self-hatred remains. So it gets projected onto one group or another. In this case, the Jews. The hatred is pure. It has to be all or nothing, no exceptions. All of the Jews are hated. If they are not, all of them, then there would be a hole in the projection, and compassion might leak through. This brings us to the idea of an alternative reality, which is what prejudice offers up. It is not the case, nor ever has been the case, that all of any group are anything. But the terms that are used to put down the group are universal. They apply to all of the members of the hated group. That's why it's an alternative reality. The most universal term used is always that they are dirty. The dirty Jews, the dirty A's, the dirty B's, the dirty C's, and so on. This has no bearing on reality. It's an alternative reality that becomes dogma. The dirt cannot be washed off. It sticks permanently until and unless one sees that the mumbo jumbo is itself an alternative reality. Some other terms thrown at the outgroup are they're lazy, stupid, cheap, devious, over-sexualized, and so on. These are all a projection of what we feel we are, or what we fear we will be thought of as being by others. These are all a projection of what we feel we are, or what we fear we will be thought of as being by others. When I was young, someone showed me that when you point your finger at somebody, you got three fingers pointing back at you. We scapegoat them and call them names that are a projection, and then we feel better about ourselves because in this alternative reality, it's better than. And if they don't agree with that determination, we hate them more, evil things to them. It becomes a closed loop syndrome. This gets passed down from one generation to another because it is too painful to do the work to slip out of that alternative. And it's not easy to do it. Education can help, but it takes more than that. It takes the development of some self-esteem, real self-esteem. We often wonder how it is that one twin will grow up to be a failure and the other twin a great success. How does that happen? I think a case can be made that one of them, for whatever reason, developed a sense of self-worth. The other did not. So we need to ask, what is it that will help kids develop a sense of self-worth and thereby outgrow the need to scapegoat and project? This is not a talk about good parenting and whole child education. Suffice it to say that good parenting and education would go a long way to healing anti-Semites. It would not lay a "you're no good" trip on their heads. So what we are down to is this. The anti-Semite most likely has begun life with a self-portrait that most people either do not know how or don't bother to do something about. This is followed by a need to pick a scapegoat or take the culture's inculcation of one. Anti-Semitism is systemic in many countries. It has seeped into the pores and mores of the culture. It has moved from the conscious to the unconscious level. We don't even have to think about it. It's subtle, so we hardly notice it. Here's an example of systemic. My paternal grandmother was wonderful and loving, and I loved her. She was also not too bright. During the days of the John Birch Society and anti-communism, it became systemic to be anti those dirty commies. My grandmother went shopping after making purchases at a store. She put the packages in the back seat of her car. She forgot to lock it. When she went to shop again, she discovered upon her return to the car that the packages in the back seat were gone. She said, and I quote, "It's those dirty communists who did it." Bless her heart. The anti-communist scapegoating had become systemic in the culture of the Cold War. Anti-Semitism is coming out of hiding more and more each year in our culture. The neo-Nazis are marching in our streets. Nobody talking about it yet, but around the corner is a law that makes it illegal for a non-Jewish person to marry a Jewish person. No? Well, the MAGA followers are already talking about a new law to again prevent interracial marriage. Will they try to prevent interethnic, interreligious marriage? This is all just another example of the crossroads Western civilization is at, between two realities, the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. Here's an example. Most of the people who have outgrown anti-Semitism would say, of course we need to respect the Jews. Of course we need to not scapegoat them. We need tolerance and compassion for the Jews. That's a good liberal's view, and it's not enough. It is definitely not enough. But what we really need is compassion for the anti-Semites. They are trapped in their own hate. They are trapped in their own hate. That burden of conscious or unconscious self-hate is a heavy cross to bear, especially when they claim that if we do not convert and join them in it, we are heretics and we will burn in hell forever. A radical would say that the anti-Semites need to get rid of the institution and its original sin mumbo jumbo that created low self-esteem that led to the anti-Semitism in the first place. If that mumbo jumbo is left in place, then self-esteem is not going to improve. Is it getting worse? No, it's getting surfaced more. What with the neo-Nazis and their ilk? Is there some hope? Yes, since religion in the West is in a serious decline. Hopefully this will continue until it is gone with all the mythical religions of the distant past. I think that anti-Semitism will not disappear until the alternative reality concept of original sin disappears from the earth. It came via the mythical magic of a forgotten apple and a talking snake. It won't disappear by magic. We have work to do. Thank you.